people do play cards on Sunday. I expected no scene, but simply asked her to excuse me. But why? Why should you not afford Mr. Morton that pleasure? She asked. I told her that I could not play cards on the Lord's Day, it was against my conscience. With that she laughed scornfully, you know her way, and said that since my conscience allowed me to join such an assembly at all, it need not be so particular as to what I did there. And she was so far right, Lucy. I had no business there, and nothing shall take me there on a Sunday night again. I told her that if she would permit me I would leave the room, and Mr. Merton said very politely, pray don't force Miss Layton's conscience, madam, another time, perhaps, she will oblige me. But my lady would not give up the point, and she must needs call in the chaplain, who talked about the danger of being righteous overmuch, and said only Methodists and fanatics indulged in such fancies. Then my lady assumed the imperious, and ordered me to sit down instantly, and I told her she must excuse me, whereat, she ordered me out of the room, and here I am. I hope you may hear no more of it, said I. If I read my lady aright, she will never forgive anyone who refuses to yield to her. I cannot help it, Lucy. Where my conscience is not concerned, where there is no question of right and wrong, I will give way to her in all things, yes, I have done already, in leaving off my mourning. But when I see things to be wrong or even doubtful, I must forbear them whatever it costs. I was right in thinking that Amabel had not heard the last of the matter. That very night my lady came to our room, and after berating Amabel in no measured terms, for fine ladies of that day used to scold and call names like fishwives, actually forgot herself so far as to box her ears. If there had been a weapon in my hand at that moment, I do believe I should have killed her. I sprang forward, but Amabel put her hand on my arm to check me, while she stood looking Lady Layton straight in the face, white as marble and as firm. Well, then, I did not mean to cuff you, though you richly deserve it, said my lady, feeling, I suppose, that she had put herself in an awkward position. I am quite ready to overlook your silly and impertinent conduct this evening, so you promise to obey me in future. I have already said, madam, that I will obey you in all matters not of conscience, replied Amabel. Which means that you will only take your own way when you want it, was the reply. We shall see who is to be mistress in this house. As for you, Corbet, turning to me, you will do your young lady no service by abetting her rebellion, I can tell you that, nor yourself either. I chose to pass over your conduct this morning, because I did not wish to make a scene in a public place, and with a childish old woman, but I can tell you I shall allow no rebellion, however it may be abetted. It would take very little to make me send you a packing, and this insolent girl to a boarding school, where she will learn to do what she is bid without appealing to her conscience. I simply curtsied. I have always found silence the best armor in dealing violent people. As to you, Miss Layton, your father is coming in a short time, and we shall then see who is to be Lady Paramount. I repeat once more that I will send your favorite woman adrift and yourself where you will learn obedience by the hardest if I see any more of these airs from either of you. With this she quitted the room. Well, we have learned something, said Amabel. We know that my father is coming. Much good he will do, was on my lips, but I did not say it. I bathed Amabel's heated cheek with elder-flower water, for my lady had struck in good earnest, and I was afraid her fingers would leave a black mark. I think she herself was scared at what she had done, for she was all sunshine and sweetness the next day even to me. She happened to hear me singing over my work, and was so much pleased with my voice as to ask, or rather command me, to come and sing for the entertainment of her company that evening. I was not sorry to oblige her, and received many compliments on my performance. After this for a time we had fair weather at the hall. I was frequently called on to sing alone, or in company with Amabel and young Mr. Dugdale, a simple young gentleman, knowing a great deal about music and china, and a very little about anything else. My lady was all honey to me, and even made me a present of some lace, small thanks to her. She intimated to me very clearly that she could make or mar my fortunes accordingly as I served her. I wanted none of her making, and, indeed, my greatest fear was that she should find out a match for me. However, I was willing, for Amabel's sake, to be on good terms with her. The next Sunday no one went to church but Amabel and myself, and Mr. Dugdale and his sister. We had a quiet, pleasant walk home, conversing on serious subjects, and Mr. Dugdale showed a little better side to his character than I had yet seen. As we reached the hall door, he asked Amabel if he should see her in the saloon that evening. "No, sir," answered Amabel. "My lady has kindly promised to excuse me." "Then, perhaps," said the young gentleman, stammering between bashfulness and earnestness. "Perhaps you will allow my sister Chatty to spend the evening with you." "Please do, Miss Layton," added Chatty. "You see, though I have a great regard for my lady, and all that," pursued Mr. Dugdale, "yet Chatty is young, and she has no mother to direct her, poor thing, and I am a man of the world, you know, but Chatty isn't, and really, you know, I do think, young ladies, you understand, if we did understand, it was no thanks to him, poor young man, but of course, one could not refuse such a request." Chatty spent the evening with us, and we had a very quiet, profitable time reading the Bible, singing, and talking. Chatty was a nice, modest, sensible young girl, who had a bias to good given her in her childhood by her mother. She was glad to talk of that mother, and to have her lessons recalled. She has since married well, and makes an excellent and happy wife and mother, with a great family of daughters, one of whom is my namesake. The next day we saw the arrival of a groom on horseback with letters to my lady, and learned that Sir Julius was expected to arrive before evening. Chapter XXII. News from the North. Sir Julius arrived sure enough, and with him Lord Bulmer, and another gentleman whom I did not know, but who was presented to Amabel as Captain Dangerfield. The moment I saw this man, I conceived an intense aversion to him, as if I had had a premonition of what he had come for. He was rather handsome indeed. I think most people would have called him very handsome, but his style of face was one which I always distrust. He had rather a high, round head, with wavy hair growing well back from his forehead, eyes at once black and shallow, and opening very widely lip and down, and eyebrows highly arched. I could judge nothing of the shape of his mouth, for he wore a heavy moustache, having been, it was understood, in the imperial service. Sir Julius was very gracious to Amabel, and hardly less so to myself. He seemed surprised at the position in which he found me, and meeting me after supper asked me why I had not been to the table. I told him the simple truth, namely, that my lady had ordered me to take my meals in the housekeeper's room, whereat, he muttered something, and seemed greatly disconcerted. I fancy, he and his wife had some words about the matter, and that she judged it best to give way, for the next day my lady sent for me, and ordered rather than invited me to take my meals with the family as usual. It was evident from the very first, that Lord Bulmer had come as Amabel's suitor. He lost no opportunity of appearing in that character, and fretted her constantly by his assiduous attentions. She on her part was barely and distantly civil, gave him the coldest and shortest answers, refused his attentions whenever it was possible, and took no more notice of his compliments than the picture of her grandmother in the saloon would have done. She kept me close by her side on all occasions, and in short gave his lordship clearly to understand that he was utterly disagreeable to her. I am not sure that this was good policy on Amabel's part. Lord Bulmer was so accustomed to conquer wherever he went, so used to being courted instead of courting, for he was esteemed the greatest match in the country, that this decided opposition on Amabel's part put him on his mettle, and made him determined to conquer her aversion and win her regard. I do think he loved her, so far as his base and sensual nature was capable of loving anything. As for my lady, I did not know how to understand her. She seemed at once to be jealous of Lord Bulmer's attentions to her stepdaughter, and desirous of forwarding his suit. At the very time she contrived to have the two tête-à-tête, by calling me to her side, I have seen her look at them, as though she would like to kill both of them. Meantime she filled the house with guests, mostly gentlemen, till there was not a spare corner, except the ghost rooms and the apartments known as the King's Chamber. I think that she would have laid violent hands on these, only that when she spoke of having them put in order, the servants, with Wilson at their head, declared they would leave the house at once, if the door was so much as opened. I knew there was no particular danger of such a catastrophe, from the simple fact that Mrs. Deborah had carried off with her the keys to that part of the house. There was no way of entering the ghostly rooms, for even the door which opened from our room had been fastened on the other side. So the guests were accommodated wherever a place could be found for them, and the shut-up rooms remained shut up still. There were a great many people coming and going, and, as I could not but observe, arriving very frequently in the night. There was much whispering in corners, and reading and writing of letters, and white flowers and ribbons were paraded upon all occasions. Only Amabel would wear none but red flowers and ribbons, though they were not especially becoming to her, and when one day my lord presented her with a basket of beautiful exotics which he had caused to be sent from his own famous hot houses, she remarked carelessly that she did not like white flowers, and gave them to chatty Dugdale, who appeared in them at dinner to my lord's evident mortification. "So you would not honor my poor flowers?" I heard him say to her afterwards. "I told you I did not like white flowers," she answered. "I beg you will put yourself to no more trouble on my account." His lordship's eyes blazed with anger, but he only bowed and turned away. The next day news arrived which made every one open their eyes. The Pretender, whose landing in Moidart in July with but 7 men at his back had been rumoured but hardly believed, had put himself at the head of the Highland clans, and eluding the vigilance and skill of General Cope, no great feat if all tales were true, had actually entered Edinburgh in triumph, and was holding his court there. There was no bound to the exultation at the hall when this news arrived. Sir Julius ordered a distribution of beef and ale to all the tenants, and a grand banquet was prepared at the hall to which all the neighbouring gentry were invited. But I noticed that very few of them came, and of the families who accepted the invitation, only the gentlemen were present. In fact, scarcely any ladies of what might be called the county families had visited Lady Leighton at all. The table was not half filled. Sir Julius' brow darkened ominously, as he looked on the vacant seats, and when the toast was proposed of health to the rightful king and confusion to usurpers, it was not received with any great degree of enthusiasm. In the year 1715, the gentry of Northumberland had risen almost as one man to support the cause of James Stuart, or the Old Pretender, as the Loyalists called him. But a new generation had arisen since then. People who remembered the 15 had also a vivid recollection of the hangings and confiscations which followed it, and had no mind to run the same risks again. Others were content to see things remain as they were. The race of nonjuring clergymen, who had done a great deal to keep alive the flame of devotion to the Stuart family, was dying out, and only here or there was one to be found. It was observed afterward, in the march to Derby, that the proclamation of King James in the towns through which the army passed excited no more enthusiasm or curiosity than would have been produced by the advertisement of a quack doctor. The ill success of his political banquet did not tend to put Sir Julius in any better humor than he was before. Neither did the fact that on the following Sunday, Mr. Lethbridge preached a really fine and eloquent sermon on the duty of resistance to rebellion and faithfulness to the existing government. His usually slow, and I must say tedious, delivery waxed nervous and decided, as he warned his hearers against being led into treasonable practices by false representations. Sir Julius, who had come to church, I suppose in compliment to his wife, looked furious. Lady Leighton yawned, laughed, and chatted all but aloud with the gentleman who sat by her. Lord Bulmer whispered something to Amabel, but was met by a look which silenced even him. I could not forbear peeping at Aunt Deborah. She seemed as if she did not know whether to be angry with the preacher for his doctrine or pleased at his vexing her sister-in-law. Indeed, I could not help thinking that Mrs. Deborah's loyalty toward James Stewart had cooled considerably, since she had learned that Lady Leighton espoused his cause so warmly. The next morning, I was sitting with Amabel in our own bedroom, when Lady Leighton's woman tapped at the door, with a summons. Miss Leighton was to attend her father and mother in the library. The time of trial is at hand, said Amabel, turning to me, after she had sent a message, that she would come at once. Pray for me, Lucy. Dear Amabel, you won't give way, said I. Indeed, I would not urge you, but I know this Lord Bulmer is a wicked man, and will make you miserable. If he were the best man in the world, it would make no difference to me, replied Amabel. My love, such as I had, is given away, and I cannot call it back. But what will you say? I asked, detaining her, as she bent to kiss me. I shall see, when the time comes. There is no use in planning beforehand. Let me go, dear. I must not keep them waiting, and since it must come, the sooner it is over, the better. This was just the difference between Amabel and me. She, as I have said before, hardly ever made a plan, and I was always making them, and then finding out that they were of no avail, and that I had after all to depend on the impulse or direction of the minute. I threw myself on my knees and prayed most earnestly, that my darling might be supported and stayed up in the deep waters through which she was called to pass, and then feeling somewhat comforted, I set myself to cheat the moments of anxiety by planning and cutting a little coat out of an old gown of Mrs. Philippa's for Mary Thornaby, who was just about short-coating her first baby. I had the little garment well under way before Amabel's step was heard in the gallery. I sprang up to meet her. She was very pale and looked ready to drop with fatigue, and as I caught her in my arms she laid her head on my neck, and wept long and bitterly. I let the tears have their way, thinking they would relieve her oppressed spirits. At last she quieted herself and then told me all about it. I found my father and his wife sitting in the library, and Lord Bulmer standing behind my lady's chair. He made me a deep reverence as he came in, but I only curtsied in general and would not look at him. Amabel, my father began, and then he hesitated and looked at his wife. Then as she declined to help him out, he began again, Amabel, your father and mother have sent for you to inform you of something which will be greatly to your advantage, and they hope to find in you an obedient and grateful daughter. I did not see anything in this which called for an answer, so I curtsied again, whereat my father said I would say peevishly, but that he is my father. Oh, curtsying is all very well, but we want an answer in words. To what, sir? I asked. To this, Miss Leighton, replied my lady, speaking suddenly and sharply. Lucy, she is like the wolf woman, as one pea is like another. Your father has received an offer for you from worthy gentlemen far beyond your desert or degree. Not so, and it please you, madam, said my lord, making another bow, nothing can be above Miss Layton's deserts. Save from the humblest of her slaves, who has never before seen a lady so worthy of his devotion, and whose whole life shall be one study to promote her happiness. My lady smiled strangely, while her eyes shot fire in their curious fashion. You plead your cause so well, my lord, that I might spare my pains. In one word, Amable, my Lord Bulmer has made proposals for your hand, and it is your father's will and wish, and yours also, I trust, madam, interrupted my lord, in a tone of deferential anxiety. I can ill want the good wishes of so old a friend. And my own, of course, said my lady, biting her red lip and frowning, that you should accept his proposals, and as the times are something disturbed and your father may be called away, we intend that the marriage should take place immediately. You may now withdraw. Stay a moment, my lady, said Lord Bulmer. Let me have the pleasure of learning from my birdie's own sweet mouth that I am accepted. You hear what my lord says, said my lady, and again it seemed as though she spoke by constraint. What have you to answer? Only this, madam. I answered, being now constrained to speak. I have already told my father that I will not marry without his consent, at least until I am of age. But I have already given my affection to a worthy man with his full concurrence, and I will never wed another. In any other matter, I am ready to yield to my father's wishes. In this I cannot do so. It is simply impossible. My father looked confused enough for a moment. May I ask who is the happy man? Asked my lord. Our daughter refers to a childish entanglement with a person in Newcastle, said my lady, that Mr. Sheridan, who has so strangely disgraced himself of late. Oh! The Methodist parson who had the adventure with the pretty milliner, said my lord, sneeringly. I should like to meet this irresistible apostle. You have already met him, my lord, I could not help saying. I had myself the pleasure of witnessing your encounter in front of Mrs. Thorpe's shop. My lord had the grace to look a little ashamed of himself. This is all folly, Amable, said my father, shortly. I will hear no more of it. You must make up your mind to accept Lord Bulmer, and that speedily. And then, he condescended to argue with me, and tell me of my lord's wealth, and the settlements he was prepared to make, and wondered I could hesitate between two such men. I do not hesitate, sir, I answered. My choice is made long since. And you will be so mean-spirited as to cling to this parson of yours, even while he is intriguing with all sorts of people, said my lady. That I do not believe, asking your pardon, madam, said I, but since you will push me to the wall, I must needs say that if there were not another man in the world, I would never marry Lord Bulmer. But you shall marry him, said Sir Julius, and he added, Lucy, I will not repeat his words. What do you expect, Sir Julius, when you allow your daughter such a companion, said my lady. That insolent girl, Lucy Corbett, abets her in her rebellion, and your own sister acts as a go-between. We shall soon settle that by giving Lucy Corbett business enough of her own to attend to, answered Sir Julius, and then he bade me go to my room and not leave it till I was prepared to do my father's will. So here I am a prisoner, and if I may but have you for my jailer, I do not care for how long. I am glad you were firm, said I, though it is a cruel necessity which makes a young girl stand out against her father. It is not my father but his wife, answered Amable. Only for her, I believe he would never have turned against Walter. Oh Lucy, how could he marry such a woman? And what is the strange power which Lord Bulmer has over her? Perhaps she wished to marry him herself and could not succeed, said I. I believe that what Wilson told me is true, and that she is under his thumb. But what means your father's remark about me? Perhaps he has a match prepared for you, also, answered Amabel. I have had my suspicions of that. Captain Dangerfield. That is a match which will never take fire, said I. I suppose Sir Julius thought better of the matter, for Amabel was sent for to supper. She told me when she returned that Lord Bulmer had hardly spoken to her or noticed her, but had devoted himself entirely to Mrs. Wardlaw, a very showy young widow, who had come on a visit from Newcastle. She was delighted, of course, said I. She seemed so, certainly. Such airs as she put on, twisting her head, and rolling her eyes, and turning about those white hands of hers. She would be pretty, if she could let herself alone, said I, but I don't admire her ways. She seems as though she could not be happy without the attention of every man within reach. But what did you do all the evening? Oh, I sat in the corner and taught Miss Dugdale how to make daisy trimming, and Mr. Dugdale entertained us with tales of his school and college days. Poor little lad! What a pity he should have an ambition to be considered a man of the world. The next morning Amabel was invited, or rather commanded, to attend her stepmother in her dressing room, and I took the opportunity of walking over to see Mrs. Deborah. I found her opening a package she had received from Newcastle. You are just in time, niece Corbett, said she. Here are a letter and a parcel for you from good Mrs. Thorpe. But before you read, tell me the news at the Hall. Is it true, as the rumor goes, that Amabel is to marry this fine Lord Bulmer? She will never marry him unless she is absolutely forced to do so, Aunt Deborah, I answered. She says that she would not wed him, if there were not another man in the world. And you think she is right, I suppose? Yes, madam, I cannot but think so, I answered. To marry one man while she loves another would be flat perjury, in my opinion. But suppose the one she loves to be unworthy. That may be a reason for refusing him, but not for marrying another. Well, child, you may be right for aught I know, said Mrs. Deborah, sighing. I am glad, at least, that we are assured there will be no marrying or giving in marriage in the next world, for I think that same marrying makes most of the trouble in this. Then if my lady makes up a match for me, and I refuse it, you will take me in, won't you, Aunt Deborah? I ventured to ask. Yes, child, you shall never want a home while I have one. But do you know whether my brother has any news from Edinburgh? I have heard of nothing new, madam. The prince has his court there and keeps possession of the city, but the castle holds out against him as does Stirling. It is also said that he intends to march into England, before long. I hear as much in my letters from Newcastle, and also that the citizens are very busy strengthening the defences and levying soldiers. By the way, Mr. Wesley is there and has made himself conspicuous by getting up a loyal address to the king. I should say the Elector of Hanover. You do not know whether my brother intends to join the prince? No, Aunt Deborah, not for certain, though I believe my lady is very earnest to have him do so. I dare say. Anything to take him out of the way, muttered Aunt Deborah. Would you not wish to have Sir Julius join the prince, Aunt Deborah? Mrs. Deborah paused before she answered. I ought to wish it, said she. Our house has always been loyal to the rightful line, and yet, child, I do not know what to say. When I think of this gallant young prince, and the stock from which he is sprung, I feel as if I could risk anything to set him on the throne of his fathers. And then on the other side, when I think of a civil war and all the horrors it brings in its train, it seems as if anything must be better than that. You say my lady is desirous of having Sir Julius go north. I am not so certain about that, madam, but there is no doubt of her loyalty to the prince. She wears no ribbons but white. She is very busy making of white favours and cockades, and receives letters from the north every day. I believe she would like to go to Edinburgh herself. Mrs. Deborah muttered something which I did not hear, and then asked me why I did not open my parcel. I was only waiting her leave to do so, and availed myself of it with all speed. It contained a letter from Mrs. Thorpe, enclosing quite a large packet, postmarked Exeter, and sealed with black. I guessed at once what had happened. My kind old kinsman was dead. So it proved. Mr. Carey, Captain Corbett's lawyer in Exeter, had written to that effect, and not knowing my exact direction had sent the letter to Mrs. Thorpe's care. Captain Corbett had died at home in his own bed, at the Wells House, as it was called, in Cornwall, and with the exception of some legacies, had left me all his property, which amounted, taking one thing with another, to about 300 a year, perhaps more. I was to enjoy 1/3 of this income till I came of age, and the whole of it till I was 25, after which the property was mine own, and was to be settled upon me in case of my marrying. If, however, I wedded any one but a loyal subject of the present government, the whole was to go to a certain orphan school, not far from Exeter. I could not but shed some tears for the kind old man who had come so far to see me. I had always thought of him, as a friend and dependence. Mr. Carey wrote very kindly, saying that he would take every care of my interest, and that if I wished it, I could come to him at once, and be a guest in his family, for as long a time as I found it convenient. His wife added a marvellously ill-spelled but very kind note to her husband's. I should say that Mr. Carey was appointed my guardian or trustee, I don't now remember the proper term. He enclosed me a sum of money, £50 I think, to provide myself with mourning and for any other occasions. I was very glad of this supply, for I had very little left, and I thought I might need it. My mourning was already to my hand. Mrs. Thorpe wrote a good deal of Newcastle news, for she was a very fluent pen woman. She told me how the walls were being fortified, and how loyal all the people were, how Mr. Wesley preached to the soldiers, and that with the approval of their officers, and how Mr. Sheridan assisted him. She said that Mr. Sheridan was thinner and graver than his wont, but worked harder than ever among the poor. Don't believe one word you hear against him, wrote the good woman. He has been slandered as others have been for the same reason, and my mind misgives me that Miss Layton will have enough of these tales poured into her ear, but there is not one word of truth in them. Never was any man more careful of giving occasion for evil speaking than he. Mrs. Thorpe told me a great deal more, as to how the people were busy with the defences of the town, how active Mr. Wesley had been in promoting loyal addresses, and how he had preached again and again, now in St. Anne's Church, the only one open to him, now at the Sandgate, to the lowest of the people, and again to the soldiers and officers at the camp, being listened to everywhere with great attention. How Mr. Sheridan, though he did not hold with him in all things, yet sought his advice and looked up to him as a father. I could see that a great change had taken place in Mrs. Thorpe's feelings toward the Methodists. I do not know that in fact any church was ever open to Mr. Wesley in Newcastle. I had news of an old friend of yours by Mr. Wesley, she added, in conclusion. He tells me that the French gentleman, who came over with us, Father Brousseau, has become a Protestant, and means, if possible, to take orders in the Church of England. Here was a budget of news, and I was in haste to carry it to Amable. I took my leave of Aunt Deborah, not thinking how soon I was to see her again, and hastened homeward. Chapter XXIII. A hasty removal. I had taken a short cut across the park in my hurry, but, as so often happens, my more haste turned out worse speed, for I got among the springs and had to go back. I knew there was a path higher up on the hillside, leading through a very quiet and sequestered part of the domain, and crossing the beck by a little stone footbridge. I struck into this path, and following it, I came out on a level spot of ground surrounded on all sides by high trees, where was a little pavilion half in ruins. The place had no very good name, being tenanted by some of the numerous bogies with which the place abounded. I was therefore the more surprised to hear voices from the interior, and to recognize one of these voices as Lord Bulmer's. I hesitated a moment what to do. The path ran close under the window, which however was raised a good deal on this side, and as the ground was soft, and the shade very deep, I thought I might slip by unperceived. Just as I came under the window, I heard Lord Bulmer say, "Let him alone, let him alone. Let my lady manage, she will give him no rest till she gets him away to Edinburgh, and then she will take matters into her own hands." "And your lordship will not forget to put in a word for me," said another voice which I did not know for the moment. "No, no. You shall have your black-eyed damsel, Dangerfield. 'Tis a pretty creature, too far more attractive to my eye than yonder statue of snow." I did not wait to hear more, but stole past the window and, once within the shadow of the wood, I ran like a hare till I reached the neighborhood of the gardens. As ill luck would have it, I met my lady face to face in the gallery. "So, girl, you have been playing truant," said she. "I have been sending to seek you everywhere." "No, madam," I answered respectfully, for I always strove to act in such a way as to give her no handle against me. "Miss Layton gave me leave to go out, and I have been to see Mrs. Deborah and the old women at the village." "Mrs. Deborah. Mrs. Deborah may find, but that does not matter now. Come into my room." I followed her, wondering what could be coming next. My lady had taken Mrs. Philippa's apartment for her own, and had fitted it up much in the style of the room in Newcastle, that I remembered so well, with painted jars and china monsters, and all kinds of decorations in painting, and shell work, and flower work, and all the other ornamental works that ever were invented. The air was heavy with the same scents I so well recollected, and warm with the fire burning on the hearth. My lady threw herself into a great chair, and I stood before her, noticing as I did so, how worn she looked, and how her wonderful beauty, for it was something wonderful even yet, seemed like a mask put on to hide the real woman underneath. She always gave me the odd idea of a spirit of some kind, inhabiting a body that was never made for it. "Lucy Corbett, sit down," were her first words. I obeyed, wondering more and more as she added, "Child, how pretty you are. Ah, if my poor little Magdalene had lived, she would have been like you. She was dark, too, but I only had her 5 years, and then lost her forever. Ah me! Your ladyship may have her again." I could not help saying, "She is in the hand of the Lord, where no evil can touch her." "So much the better if she is," was the abrupt reply. "There, child, don't talk Methodism to me. I am too old for that sort of thing." "Surely, no one is too old for the comforts of religion, madam." I persisted, impelled by I know not what impulse, but I trust a good one. "It seems as if such a treasure in heaven should be a strong magnet to draw one thitherward." "Tush," said my lady sharply and bitterly. "What do I know of heaven, or care to know? I tell you, child, this world is all that we can grasp or hold. What do we know of the other? This alone is ours." "For how long, madam?" She winced at the question. "There, that will do. You have discharged your conscience, and I wish to hear no more. Listen to me. I like your spirit, child, and if you will be obedient to me and help me, I will advance your fortunes and perhaps protect you from some dangers. I trust not to fail in my duty, madam. I began, but she snapped me up. Duty? Nonsense, listen to me. Lucy Corbett, Amabel must marry Lord Bulmer, she must, there is no help for it. If she or you struggle or oppose, you will but make matters worse for her. If she gives up with a good grace, he may be kind to her, for he is greatly in love with her, though she angers him by her coldness. If she continues her present conduct, he will revenge it on her, when she is in his power, for marry him she must. She paused a moment, and then went on in a lighter tone. You must see that it is for Amabel's interest to treat Lord Bulmer with civility at least, since she must marry him at last. Use your influence to induce her to do so, and I will reward you for it. A very good match has been proposed for you, better than you have reason to hope for, with a well-born gentleman high in the service of King James. I will persuade my husband to accept the offer, and will provide for you like a lady. Refuse to do what I wish, and you will leave this house, and be separated from Amabel forever, for you may be sure that Lord Bulmer will suffer no one near his wife who shall oppose his power over her. She ceased and sat looking at me with those strange eyes, in a way which made me think of a story Mr. Thorpe had told us, of certain poison snakes which draw birds into their mouths by looking at them. I felt as though a web was being woven round me, taking from me all power of free motion. I made a vigorous effort, said a short prayer for grace and direction, and then spoke out. Madam, will you please tell me in so many words what it is that you would have me do, then I can tell whether it is in my power or not. Frankly spoken, returned my lady, apparently not ill-pleased. I will have you use your influence with Amabel to give up Mr. Sheridan and consent to marry Lord Bulmer. Tell her that you have received certain news of her lover's infidelity and his approaching marriage. Work on her pride, of which she has abundance, and shame her out of caring for a man who has ceased to care for her. Tell her that Lord Bulmer has promised never to interfere with her religion, and that he also promises her every indulgence, even to having you live with her, if you do not marry. And if I refuse to do this, said I, then you leave this house forever, she answered, suddenly and sharply. There, I do not wish to hear your decision now. Go and think about it. Remember, girl, that I have your life and character in my hand, she repeated, shutting her small, thin hand, as if she would crush something she held within. Now go, and come when I send for you. I made my curtsy and withdrew to our room. Amabel was not there, having gone out riding with her father, whom she strove carefully to please in all things. I was not sorry to be alone. What a wave of temptation rolled in upon me. Suppose I were to refuse obedience to my lady, what would be the result? I should be separated from Amabel, my second self, never, perhaps, to see her again. My reputation would be ruined. I knew enough of my lady to know that she would not scruple to tell any story about me, and I also knew that the fact of living under her roof would be no advantage to me. On the other hand, if Amabel married Lord Bulmer, it would be no more than hundreds of girls did every year at the bidding of their parents. He had been a bad man, no doubt, but not worse than many other young men. He was very much in love with Amabel, that was plain to be seen, and she might have such an influence over him as to reform him. I had heard and read of such things. She would have everything that the world has to give, and, if she were not interfered with in religious matters, why could she not happy after all? Mr. Sheridan had not written to her, though he might easily have sent a note in Mrs. Thorpe's letter to me. Perhaps what my lady said was true, and he was going to marry someone else. How long I sat pondering these things I do not know, but I was roused by the sound of the noon bell, the Angelus, which was always rung at high beck when the lord of the manor was at home. In a moment, a clear vision arose before me. I seemed to be standing once more in the old convent vault, holding fast to Mother Superior's hand, and gazing with awe and dread at that sullen and dismal pool, whose black waters hardly reflected the gleams of the lantern. I smelled the strange damp odor of the vault. I felt the soft and sticky ground under my feet, which seemed to catch and hold me fast, and I heard dear Mother's sweet and solemn voice saying, "This is the pit of destruction, and every willful sin brings you nearer to it." The spell was broken. I sprang from my seat and walked rapidly up and down the room. How could I for a moment have dreamed of such a thing? What good would it have done if I had consented? I should not have moved Amabel one hair's breadth, and I should have lost her friendship forever. I should have been doing the devil's own work, to be paid with his wages. No, it never could be, whatever the consequence to her or to me. I could not do this great wickedness and sin against God. The straight path was the only safe path, and, though it might seem to be hedged with briars and built up with stones, I must follow it. Through whatever scenes of trouble it might lead me in this world, the end was sure. Then the tempter would try me on the other side. Was I quite sure which was the right path? Were not children to obey their parents? Would not Amabel have great means of doing good? Was not I myself throwing away chances of usefulness such as I might never have again? Was I not dishonoring my Christian profession by abetting Amabel's disobedience, and suffering a slur to be cast on my own good name? Had I not been taught by my former spiritual guides that falsehood was a venial sin, and might even become a virtue in the cause of religion? But I knew now who was speaking to me, and how to answer him. I threw myself on my knees and prayed earnestly for help and direction, and I had it. It could never be right to do evil that good might come. I did not believe that Mr. Sheridan was unfaithful. I had evidence to the contrary under my hand, and I should be a base liar and slanderer if I told Amabel what I did not myself believe. No, come what might, I must be true to her, to my master, to myself. Oh, if she would only come in, that I might speak to her, that I might warn her, that I might tell her what I had heard. I thought for a moment what it was best for me to do. I took Mrs. Thorpe's letter, folded it small, and put it into Amabel's prayer book, where she would be sure to find it. I wrote a few words to her, telling her that I might be sent away from her for a time, begging her to believe that I could not help it, and telling her that I would communicate with her if possible. I had hardly finished these preparations when my lady's French woman knocked at the door, and told me I was to go to her mistress at once. I found my lady sitting where I had left her. She bade me be seated, and signed to her woman to withdraw. "Well, Lucy Corbett, have you considered this matter?" "I have, madam." "And what is the answer?" "The answer is no, madam," I replied, with a firmness that surprised myself. "I have looked at the thing on all sides, and have come to the conclusion that I cannot serve you in this matter." "Then the thing will be done without you, that is all," said my lady coolly, though she looked disconcerted. "The thing will be done all the same, and you will lose the profit, that is all." "What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" The words seemed to come without any will of mine. My lady looked taken aback, but she recovered herself in a moment. "Nonsense, child. Leave such dreams and delusions to the vulgar, and those who have their living to make thereby. I tell you again, girl, this world is all we can grasp, all that we can make sure of. Let us make ourselves happy here, and leave the next, if there be any next, to care for itself. Your ladyship is happy here, then? What do you mean? How dare you, said she, strangely agitated for a moment. Then resuming her lofty and careless demeanour, think well, Lucy Corbett, think well, before you speak. Is this your final answer? It is, madam. I replied, though a sharp pain seemed to rend my heart as I thought of all my words involved. I cannot help you in this matter. Then you leave this house on the instant, said my lady, sternly. Taking with you my own and my husband's anger, and what relics of character your escapades here and in Newcastle have left you. You whom my husband, in his folly, has educated to be a fine lady at his expense. You shall learn what it is to be without a home. Much more she said, which I will not set down here, calling me a beggar more than once. Not quite a beggar, madam, since Sir Julius has always drawn 200 a year from my father's estate, said I, as she paused from sheer lack of breath. As to what you threaten, I am in the hands of one who knows my innocence, and will not let my enemies triumph, even though they may seem to do so for a time. Oh, my lady, think of what you are doing before you take the last downward step that may make return impossible. Think of your own child in heaven, and of how you would have had her dealt by, before you go any farther. I do not speak for myself, though in driving me from my foster sister, you are breaking both our hearts. I have both means and friends, who will not see me wronged. But think, oh think. The judge even now stands before the door. Even now your hour may have struck, and the world you so love may be slipping from under your feet. Whose then will those things be which you have provided? What pleasure will they give you when you lie cold in death on yonder bed, and cannot raise so much as an eyelid to see or a finger to touch one of them? You might be so happy with Amabel, if you would. She would be to you all your own child might have been, if you would but let her. You know Lord Bulmer to be a wicked, hard, cruel man, you know it. Oh, do not sin by putting into his power the child the good Lord has given you, to make up for the one he took away, and to lead you to heaven. My lady listened without interrupting me, and I almost thought she was going to yield. But she did not, though I believe her good angel whispered to her. Her face, which had softened for a moment, grew hard as stone, and her eyes shone balefully, while her red lips were compressed to a thread. She stood for a moment at the parting of two ways. Then she deliberately chose the wrong one, and walked on to her ruin. She would have the world for her portion, and she had it. You will leave this house at once, said she, taking out her purse as she spoke. Wilson will send your clothes after you wherever you choose. If Amabel ever speaks to you again, I will send her where she shall learn that there are worse things than stepmothers. But I do not wish to expose you to temptation by sending you away penniless. What wages are owing to you? My Cornish blood flashed up at this gratuitous insult. Thy money perish with thee, said I have enough of my own, but if I were starving, I would take nothing from your hand. As to my character, perhaps Mrs. Deborah's countenance may go as far in the country as Lady Throckmorton's. I don't defend myself in saying this. It was not according to the spirit of meekness, and it was foolish besides, for it lost me the advantage I had while I kept cool. But however unwisely sped, the arrow reached its mark and found a joint in the armor. Scarcely one of the county ladies had called upon Lady Layton. You defy me, do you? Said she. No. I replied, recalled to myself. I was wrong to speak so. Not that I fear you, Lady Layton. But I want nothing from this house save what is rightly mine. I have not wrought for gold, and I have no debts to put me in any man's power. She winced at this, I could see, but answered haughtily. I am not here to bandy words with a discharged waiting maid. Go and put your things together such as you need at once. The rest I will give orders about. Leave this house within half an hour, or I will order the men to put you forth, like what you are. It showed the essentially cruel nature of the woman, that she should add this insult to the injury she had already done me. And it was to her that I must leave my love, my Lily, my other self. I can hardly recall, even now, without sickness of heart, the feelings with which I gathered together so many of my possessions as I could conveniently carry. I had not finished when Mrs. Wilson came to the room followed by the French waiting woman. So Miss Corbett, I always said pride would have a fall, said she, in her old insolent tone, which she had not used toward me for many a day. Just be pleased to separate your things from Miss Layton's, will you? Fine doings, when a young lady and her waiting woman keep their clothes together in the same drawers. But there will be an end of all that now. I did not answer, but stepped into the closet to take my Bible and prayer book. Wilson followed me, and, shutting the door as if by accident, she seized my hand and whispered, "Poor thing, I know how it is. Don't you take it too much to heart, but keep up your spirits, and I will look after your things, and send all safe." I dared not speak before that French spy. Then aloud, "I cannot let you take that, Miss Corbett, not till I have Miss Layton's leave. Wilson, if I have ever done you a good turn, be kind to Miss Layton." I whispered. I will, and it shall go hard, but I will get you news of her." "What shall I tell her?" "Tell her I was sent away, that they would not let me stay to see her." "I am going to Mrs. Deborah." "Quite right. I'll befriend her, if only to save my poor dear lady from sinning. Don't be too hard on her, Miss Corbett. She is in trouble herself." Then aloud again, "There, you have had time enough, in all conscience. So pack off." "No, I don't want any money, miss," as I offered her a gold piece I had in my pocket. "There, go. I'd say God bless you, if I dared." "God bless you, Wilson, and teach you to know and follow him," said I. I followed her downstairs carrying my basket. As I left the hall, I had just a glimpse of Amabel, flushed with exercise and looking more cheerful than I had seen her for a long time. Oh, for one word! But I dared not linger, and I turned away. 2 or 3 of the men laughed sneeringly as they saw me go forth, and one of them made an insolent remark, whereat Harry, the only footman who had remained behind when Richard left, turned on him and knocked him down into a particularly thorny rosebush. "Take that for your impudence to a young lady," said he, and then coming to my side, "Let me carry your parcels for you, Miss Corbett." "Thank you, Harry, but I fear you will get into trouble with my lady, and perhaps lose your place." "I don't care that for my place," said Harry, snapping his fingers. "Besides, I have given warning already. I don't care to stay in this house as things go now. I wasn't brought up to such things, and I don't care about getting used to 'em." So saying, he fell behind and carried my bundles all the way to the little house. Mrs. Deborah was in her little garden gathering some late flowers, and she looked up, surprised enough to see me so soon again. Then observing Harry with his load, and perhaps seeing something in my face which told her the story, she opened her arms to me. I fell on her faithful breast, and the anguish which had been rending my heart found a merciful vent in a tempest of tears and sobs. Mrs. Deborah led me into her little parlor, seated me on the sofa, and putting her arms about me, she let me weep my full before she asked me a single question. Then, as I grew calmer by degrees, she drew from me the story of my expulsion from the hall. She is a wicked woman, and you are well out of her hands, said Mrs. Deborah. As to your character, I do not think you have much to fear upon that score. It is not myself that I think about, I replied. I would willingly bear all she can inflict, to save Amabel out of her hands. We must ask God's help for her, said Mrs. Deborah, solemnly. I know no better way at present or at any time. But, oh, Mrs. Deborah, what can Sir Julius be thinking of? I cried. How can he let his daughter be so sacrificed? Mrs. Deborah's brow darkened. Child, it is the curse of our house, said she abruptly, that the men should be wholly governed by some woman or other. His father was so before him, as I know to my cost. My father married a second time, and his wife Julius's mother so drew his heart away from his elder children that he had hardly a kind word for us, and would have utterly disinherited us had it been in his power. My brother's second wife was not a lady, but she was a kind, good woman, and would have been a good friend to the child had she but lived. But it was not God's will. The question is, what is to be done now, said I, with a little impatience, I fear. We can make no move at present, replied Mrs. Deborah. All we can do is to wait. My poor child, it is hard upon you, I know, but you must see that we must act, if at all, with great caution. Amabel is in her father's hands and under his roof, and we have no right to interfere, so long as she is not in actual danger. Take patience, my poor child, take patience. 'Tis the woman's medicine. With that, I fell to crying again, and grew so hysterical that Mrs. Deborah made haste to put me to bed, and dose me with hartshorn. I was not given to such attacks, but I was overcome with grief and fatigue. I quieted myself as soon as I could, and after a while I fell asleep, and awoke somewhat refreshed and composed. I lay a long time thinking over all that had happened. I did not see how I could have acted otherwise. Even had I dissembled with my lady, and promised to use my influence for her when I did not intend to do so, she would soon have found me out, for her eyes were everywhere, and her French waiting maid was a ready and willing spy. No, I could not have done otherwise. For myself, as I said, I had no cares or fears. Mrs. Deborah would give me a home as long as I needed one, and so I did not doubt would Mrs. Brown, were it only to spite her brother's wife, and then there was Mr. Carey in Exeter. True, it was a long way off, but others had made the journey and why not I? Again, there was Mrs. Thorpe in Newcastle, and the old lady of Thorney Haugh. Oh yes, I had a plenty of friends. But Amabel? To have her so near me, and yet out of my reach, and beyond my help. It did seem to me that the thought was intolerable, and I cried aloud in my anguish. Then at last I betook myself to that place whither I should have gone at first. I laid my case before him, who has promised to be the friend of the oppressed and the orphan, told him all my woe, and besought his help. I laid my dear one at his feet, as a mother of old might have brought her suffering babe to the Lord Jesus, and besought him to have a care over her. Having thus calmed myself, I arose, dressed, and went down to seek Mrs. Deborah. It was near evening, and the level sun was shining into the south and west windows and lighting up the low rooms. Mrs. Deborah had brought away so many of her own and Mrs. Chloe's personal matters, that the little sitting room had a curiously familiar look, as we see in a dream a well-known place which we know to be the same, though it not in the least like the reality. Mrs. Deborah was sitting with her knitting as of old. She called me to a seat beside her, and seeing that I had no work, she opened a drawer, and took out something that carried me back to the old inn at Newcastle, Mrs. Chloe's bed quilt knitting. "There, child, you may work at that at odd minutes, if you like. It does very well to take up when you have nothing else to do, and I should like to see the quilt finished." We talked long and earnestly over Amabel's affairs, but when our conversation was broken off by a call to supper, we could arrive at no other conclusion than that we had already come to, namely, that we must wait and let matters take their course for the present. We had not finished our meal when we heard horses' feet outside, and were surprised by the entrance of Sir Julius. With all reverence, I must say the great man reminded me of nothing so much as of a dog, that has to face his master with a stolen joint of meat on his conscience. In vain did Sir Julius strut and frown and try to look big and impressive. He was cowed under his sister's grey eyes and black brows, and looked as though he expected every moment to be taken across the old lady's knee and disciplined with her slipper. He took on an elevated tone of reproof toward me at first, and talked of ingratitude and the expense he had been put to on my account, but he came down from his high horse rather suddenly when Mrs. Deborah remarked, drily, that my father's rents must have a good deal more than paid all the cost of my education, and that no doubt he would be ready to account for the surplus, when called upon to do so. "And pray, Sister Deborah, who is to call me to any such account?" "Perhaps Lucy herself, when she comes of age, or possibly Mr. Carey, her trustee, under her uncle's will." This was news to Sir Julius. He eagerly inquired what his sister meant, and received an account of Mr. Andrew Corbett's will. He asked to see the letter, and I showed it to him. "And you must take just this time to quarrel with my lady," said he, irritably. "Why could not you let her say, and keep quiet?" "Because she would not let me," I answered. "I have ever treated her with respect, as you know, but when she came to require of me to be downright false to myself and treacherous to Amabel, oh, false and treacherous," he broke in peevishly, repeating my words. "Could you not temporize a little? But you and Amabel have got your heads full of Methodistical notions, and you are wiser in your own conceits than 10 men that can render a reason." "They might be that, and not be absolute Solomons, were the reason no better than some men's," said Mrs. Deborah, drily. "And I had such a good match for you, and have pledged my word to Bulmer that you should marry Dangerfield, and what am I to say to him?" I did not see that I was called upon to furnish Sir Julius with words, so I remained silent and knitted as though all my energies were given to the square of cotton in my hands. Sir Julius fussed and fumed and swore, and stalked about, and getting no help from either of us, he suddenly changed his tone, and began to coax me to come back to the hall. He would make my peace with my lady. Dangerfield was a gallant gentleman, and a great favourite with the Prince and King James. He was sure to rise, and I might be a countess before I died. Amabel and I were 2 silly girls, quarrelling with our bread and butter. He wished to heaven he had left us in our convent. Then, growing angry again, he vowed that Amabel at least should bend to his will, and with that, he dashed away. The next morning early, long before day, I was waked by the trampling of many horses, and the sound of subdued talking. I rose, and looked out of my window, which commanded a view of the road. By the bright moonlight, I saw a train of horsemen. There were about 30 in all, and Sir Julius rode at their head. I looked eagerly to see if Lord Bulmer was among the riders. He was a very big man, head and shoulders above any other man about the place, and looked especially tall on horseback, but I saw nobody that I could take for him. I could not sleep again, and the moment I heard Mrs. Deborah stirring, I went to her room and told her what I had seen. "He has gone then," said Mrs. Deborah. "He has cast in his lot with this young adventurer, and who knows whether he will ever return." I ought to rejoice in his loyalty and courage, but something seems to tell me he is influenced neither by one nor the other, but by base subserviency to the will of a wicked woman. Nay, madam, said I, Sir Julius has always expressed the warmest devotion to King James and the Prince. One ought not to think the worse of a good cause because it is espoused by a wicked person. In my heart, I was by no means sure of the goodness of the cause. All Mrs. Deborah's lessons, all my reading in Clarendon, Ken, and Sancroft, had not convinced me of the divine right of kings, and the duty of absolute, passive obedience to their will, nor had they impressed me with any very exalted notions of the virtues of the Stuart family, but I was willing to comfort my dear old friend so far as was possible. My own heart was full of anxiety for Amabel, left as she was in the power of her enemies, without even the feeble support of her father's regard. Well, Amabel will at least be left in peace for a while, said Mrs. Deborah, after a pause. No doubt Lord Bulmer will have accompanied my brother. He was not with him this morning, I am sure, I replied, and gave my reasons. Even were it so, they will not drive on the business during my brother's absence. I am not so sure of that either, said I. She would never be so bold. I believed Lady Leighton bold enough for anything, and said so, telling Mrs. Deborah what I had heard in my walk. I did not add what I thought, that Sir Julius had gone away on purpose to leave matters in the hands of his wife. One hesitates before telling a sister that her only brother, the head of her house, is a base coward, even though one may be convinced that she knows as much already. Chapter XXIV. An early snow saves muckle woe. It was 2 or 3 days before we heard a word from the hall. Even my clothes were not sent to me, and I began to think I was to be deprived of them. Meantime a visitor arrived in the shape of Alick Graham, old Elsie's nephew, and Lady Thorneyhoe's servant. He brought Mrs. Deborah a present of moor game, cheeses, and fine wool for her knitting, of his mistress' own spinning, and for Amabel and me each a large soft plaid or mantle, such as were then worn by all classes in Scotland. He would fain have gone at once to the hall to see his sweetheart, saying that he had but little time to stay, and, in the language of the old ballad, he could not come ilka day to woo. But Elsie persuaded him to bide a wee, as she said, seeing it was not likely that Mary would see him unless she had notice beforehand of his coming, which she, Elsie, would try to send her. They were still arguing the point, when who should appear but Mary herself, with my bundles and some of her own, escorted and assisted by Harry, who, I fancy, would gladly have cut out the handsome young borderer, had it been in his power. I left the two glaring at each other like two dogs, whom prudence or politeness restrains from fighting in the house, and took Mary into Mrs. Deborah to learn her news. My lady has sent me away, miss, sobbed Mary, bursting into tears. And without a bit of a character, and she called me a thief to my face, me that never touched so much as a pin that did not belong to me, and though Mrs. Wilson herself said she wished every one in the house was as honest as I was. I soothed and comforted Mary as well as I could, and Mrs. Deborah told her she would give her the best of characters, which seemed to afford her a little consolation. And what of Miss Leighton? I asked, when Mary had recovered her composure. How is she? Well enough in health, miss, but sad enough in her spirits, as well she may be. My lady taunts and sneers at her from morning till night, and then, there is Lord Bulmer hanging round, and giving orders in the house, who but he, as though he were its master and more. It's my belief as they mean to compel my poor young lady into a marriage whether or no. But how can they? I asked. Mr. Lethbridge would never lend himself to such business. No, miss, but there's that Mr. Trimble Chaplain as they call him, he is none too good at the best, and when he is half seas over, as he is about half the time, he will do anything for more liquor. By what my lord's man let out one day, I believe he was brought to the hall for this very job. I looked at Mrs. Deborah and wrung my hands with impatience and anxiety. Take care, Mary Lee. Say no more than you know to be true, said Mrs. Deborah, gravely. I'm sure I beg your pardon, Mrs. Deborah, ma'am, if I spoke disrespectful, said Mary. But oh, Mrs. Deborah. Oh, ladies. Do save my poor young lady. They will kill her among them. They have shut her up alone in her room with no one near her, only that wicked French woman takes her meals, and poor meals they are. Even Mrs. Wilson is not allowed to go to her. And, Mrs. Deborah, the wolf howled last night. I heard him myself, and so did all of us, and Harry says it bodes some great misfortune. And worse than that, here her voice sank to a whisper, the picture of the wolf lady came out of its frame and walked about the house. Ellen saw it. Nonsense, said Mrs. Deborah, but she looked uneasy. I knew very well that she herself believed in the howling of the wolf as portending some great misfortune, and that she was not entirely incredulous on the subject of the walking picture. Where did Ellen see the wolf lady? I asked. In the long gallery, miss. She had been down to the kitchen to get a warm salt bag to put to Hannah's cheek, for the poor thing is half dead with an income in her face, and she made bold to go through the gallery to reach the little stairs. She heard a voice as if pleading as for very life in the little saloon, and another deep voice that seemed to answer in scorn, Ellen said, and she had just time to slip behind the great Indian screen, when the lady came out in a long white gown, and with both hands pressed to the sides of her head. She passed along so close that Ellen said she could almost have touched her, and went into the great hall, and then Ellen ran upstairs to her own room. I glanced at Mrs. Deborah. I did not believe in the ghostly character of Ellen's vision, neither, I saw, did she. When did you last see Miss Layton, Mary? I asked. Yesterday morning, miss. And Lord Bulmer is still at the hall? He did not go with Sir Julius. Oh, no, ma'am, Captain Dangerfield did, but he is back again today. Oh, Mrs. Deborah, save my dear young lady. Did you bring me no note or message, then? I asked. Yes, miss. I forgot. One from Mrs. Wilson. She has been very good to me, has Mrs. Wilson. She said the note was about some napkins or something. I took the note, and, dismissing Mary to her supper and the society of her favored lover, I opened it. It was fairly well written, and I had no trouble in reading it. Miss, if ever you loved Miss Layton, contrive some way to help her tonight. The word was underscored. Tomorrow may be too late. They will all be in the great saloon at the other end of the house acting of plays. Miss is shut in her room. They will not let me near her. I sign no names for fear of accidents. Remember, tonight. This, disentangled from her peculiar spelling, was Mrs. Wilson's note. Mrs. Deborah looked at me in dismay. What can we do, said she. I considered a moment, and a plan darted into my head, which I proceeded to open to Mrs. Deborah. That might do so far as getting Amabel away from the house is concerned, said Mrs. Deborah. But what to do with her afterward? I could not keep her here with any safety, and there are strong reasons against her going to Newcastle. I have an idea about that too, I returned. But we must call Elsie and her nephew in council. I think we can depend on their fidelity. My life for Elsie in such a case, said Mrs. Deborah. I will send for her at once. Elsie made her appearance and I told her what I had in my head. Alick had ridden a stout pony and Mrs. Deborah had plenty of others, for horses were abundant and cheap in those days, in the north. Why should not Amabel and myself return with Alick to Eskdale, and take refuge with Lady Thorneyhaugh till better times? And indeed the lasses, I mean the young leddies, could not do better. Alick will ken every pass among the hills by night as well as by day, and by noon tomorrow, they may be in safety, said Elsie. Alick, being called in, laughed at the idea of pursuit, once we were among the hills. It will no be very murk after midnight, though I doubt there's a storm brewing. I ken every path between here and Eskdale. Let us once have a good start and let them follow wha can. And Mary and me will just slip cannily awa after dark to the house of a seventh cousin of my Anne, who will give us a blithe welcome, added Elsie. Then if anyone hears of Alick's riding home with two women, folk may just think it was his Joe and his auld auntie. Sweetheart. There was little time to lose, for it was drawing toward night already, and by midnight we must be well on our way. Everything favored us. The night was dark, with a fitful wind from the east, which I well knew would make all sorts of eerie noises about the old hall. I made up 2 bundles of needful clothing, dressed myself in a thick grey woolen gown, and wrapping my plaid about me, I stole up through the woods to the hall. The east wing was brilliantly lighted, as was also the great hall, and the sound of musical instruments told me that the revel was in full progress. In the west wing burned only one dim light, and that I well knew was in Amabel's room. I do not pretend to be above fears more than other people, and I shuddered with something besides cold when I found myself in the little deserted court where the phantom cavalier was said to walk, and when I applied the well-oiled key to the lock, I could almost have sworn that a light hand was laid on my shoulder. Nothing was to be seen, however, and in the cause of my foster sister, I would have faced the evil one himself. I unlocked the door, and lighting the dark lantern I carried, I went softly down and then up the rugged stairs, and found myself in the ghostly room. I stayed not to look around me, but knocked gently at the door of communication. There was no answer, and for a moment my heart sunk at the thought that Amabel might have been forced to be present at the play. I blew my little ivory whistle very softly at the keyhole, and to my intense delight I heard Amabel's voice. "Lucy, where are you?" "In the ghost room," was my answer. "Open the door quickly." "I cannot," was the answer. "It is fastened on your side." I found the bolt and pushed it back. The cabinet was rolled aside, and in a moment, Amabel was in my arms. She was but the shadow of herself, but her lovely face was calm as ever. "Is it really you?" said she, holding me off and looking at me. "I almost lost hope when they took poor Mary from me. Oh, Lucy, I have been cruelly used. I have come to save you, but there is not a moment to lose," said I. "Don't take anything from the room. I have wraps in abundance. Come." I pulled the cabinet back to its place, drew down the tapestry and bolted the doors. We hastened down the stairs and out into the court. A few drops of rain were falling, and it was pitch dark. Amabel held the lantern, while I locked the door, and barred the entrance to the court on the outside. We then made the best of our way to the old pavilion, where Alick was to await us with the horses. He was not in sight. "Can he have played us false?" was my first thought. I whistled softly and had the satisfaction to see him emerge from a thicket of evergreens. "It is all well so far, leddies," said he. "Hasten to mount, and let us be on our way. I believe it is going to snow, but so much the better for us. Early snow saves muckle woe, the auld byword has it." I had taken the precaution to bring from home a thick gown and riding skirt. These I hastily put on Amabel, over the silk gown she wore. A lick put her on horseback and we set out on our dark, long ride. "Are we not going first to Aunt Deborah's?" asked Amabel as we turned our horses' heads away from the village. "No," I answered. "We must lose no time, and if you should be missed, they would go to the little house at once to seek you. We must run no risks that we can help." Amabel murmured an assent and said no more. The remembrance of that wild night's ride is like a dream to me. I only know that it snowed till after midnight, that it was very dark, and Aleck seemed to find his way by some occult sense like a dog. We went up hill and down dale. We forded swollen streams where the ponies could hardly stem the current, and climbed and descended paths so steep and slippery that it was a wonder how they kept their feet or we our seats. Once or twice we passed camps or trains of smugglers conveying whiskey from Scotland into England, but they took no notice of us except to exchange a civil or surly good night with our guide, who I fancy, might have owed his intimate knowledge of the road to some practice in the same profession. Once we saw a camp of gypsies in a recess of the hills, their bright fire looking wonderfully attractive in the cold and darkness. The snow was now quite deep and muffled the sound of our horses' feet, which was perhaps the reason why the gypsies took no notice of us. "I'm glad we are well past the folk," said Aleck in a whisper. "They are no good folk to meet in a dark night and a lonely place. Is the other Letty waking, do you think, Mem? Speak to her and see." "Are you awake, Amabel?" said I, taking her hand, which felt cold as ice. "Awake," she repeated in a tone of wonder. "I do not feel as if I should ever sleep again. Lucy, why do we not go faster? They will follow us. I would fine like to see them try it, Mem, said Aleck, overhearing her words. For by any trouble they might have in finding the road, they might not pass the gentry with the pack horses so easily as we have done. They are no apt to be that civil to folk they do can. Na. Dinna be feared my bonny do I mean my Letty. We'll be in Scotland in another hour. See, yonder comes the moon." The storm had now ceased, and the waning moon shone out through the clouds, so that we could see where we were going. We had ridden another half hour, when Aleck drew bridle on the top of a long hill we had been climbing, and pointed out to me a dark spot in the waste of snow. "Yonder is Tibby Gray's cottage, Mem. We shall soon be there, and then we can rest ourselves and our horses. Tibby is an honest woman, a far awa cousin of my own, and will give food and fire and a welcome to boot, to any friend to Thorney Haugh." I was thankful to hear it, for I was growing very weary, and so sleepy that I could hardly keep myself awake. We descended a rougher path than any we had yet passed, so rough indeed, that Aleck dismounted and led our ponies by the bridle a part of the way. The tree branches brushed our faces in some places, in others, the rocks towered high and seemed ready to fall down on us. "It is turning colder," said I, shivering. "So much the better, Mem. We'll no have the snow wreath sliding down on our heads. But we'll soon be out of this den, and then the road is good." In effect we soon came out upon a wider valley, and presently drew up at the door of a small cottage, the same we had seen from the top of the hill. Aleck whistled once or twice. The door was opened by a decent-looking woman, with a tartan screen cast over her white mutch. What is this?" said the old woman, who I fancy, might not be unused to untimely visitors. "Man Aleck, is this you? And what are these?" Whist, Tibby. "It's just myself, and these are two, young leddies, that I am guiding to my auld Letty at Thorney Haugh, and you must just give them the best you ha for them. Best tell her the truth, Mem, he whispered to me. She will do all the better for us." That will I, said old Tibby, cheerfully. Come in, by laddies. Come in by, and sit upon the fire. It is but a coarse night for, the likes of you to be out. Eh, the bonny do, she exclaimed, as she removed Amabel's plaid. Wha could ha the heart to hurt such a winsome creature? But I'll no fash you with questions. Come in by, and sit upon the fire. She led us into the cottage, where a great fire of turf, made on the earthen floor, threw out a glow which seemed something miraculous to us poor night wanderers. Tibby set stools for us, removed our wet plaids and riding skirts, and in a wonderfully short time, put into our hands basins of warm milk and generous pieces of freshly toasted oatcake. Eat and drink, said she. That will warm you best of a dot. Do try to eat something, Amabel, said I, seeing that she held her basin of milk in her hand, as if she hardly knew what it was. Do try, dear, to please me. I held the basin to her lips, and had the satisfaction to see her drink. Then, as if roused and refreshed, she looked about her and spoke. Lucy, why do we not go on to my aunt's? Because the horses must rest, my bonny leddy, said Alick, answering the question. The puir beasts cannot gang a fit farther, without rest and meat, and we will be none the war of them our selves. But they will overtake us and find us here, said Amabel. I am sure they will. They will track us with the bloodhounds. Not they. I answered. They have not missed us yet, and when they do they would not know which way to go. The snow will have covered all trace of us. And that's true, mem. Believe me, there is nothing to dread, you are as safe here as if you were at Thorney Haugh. I dare say you are right, said Amabel. But I am bewildered, I think. Oh, Lucy. It seems as though it must be a dream, I have dreamed of getting away so often. It seems as if I must wake and find myself still in that woman's power. But I will never go back to her, she added wildly. I will kill myself first. You must just get her to bed, poor lamb, said old Tibby, answering my look of alarm. The poor bairn is just overdone with as she has come through. Shame on them that brought a sweet lamb to such straits. As she spoke, she opened a door, on the farther side of the room and let